We have four wonderful panelists. I'll introduce them from left to right. Professor Amy Wax is a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Her research is focused primarily on the intersection of economics and social welfare policy, including how such factors affect family and workplace relations. Her most recent book is Race, Wrongs, and Remedies: Group Justice in the 21st Century. She previously worked as an assistant to the Solicitor General in the United States Department of Justice, where she argued 15 cases before the Supreme Court. She received her Bachelor's of Science from Yale before receiving both an MD from Harvard Medical School and a JD from Columbia Law School. Jeremy Carl is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, where his primary focus is on immigration, multiculturalism, and nationalism in America. Prior to joining Claremont, Jeremy worked for a decade as a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, serving as a policy advisor to many national political figures. Jeremy is the author and editor of several books on energy policy, and his political writing and commentary have been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, National Review, Politico, and The Economist. Jeremy received a BA with distinction from Yale University. He holds an MPA from the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard University and did doctoral work at Stanford University, where he was a Packard Foundation Stanford Graduate Fellow. Garett Jones is the BB&T Professor for Study of Capitalism at George Mason University. He's written a number of books analyzing the intersection of economics and government policy, particularly analyzing the effects of immigration on the economy. He's also worked as an economist in Congress. He received his BA from Brigham Young University and his PhD from the University of California, San Diego. Simon Hankinson, finally, last but not least, is a senior research fellow in the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation. From 1999 until 2022, he was a Foreign Service officer, serving in India, Fiji, Ghana, Slovakia, Togo, Washington, D.C., Marseille, and Nairobi. Prior to entering the State Department, Hankinson worked as a lawyer in London. Then he taught history, English, and drama at a private school in Miami. Hankinson holds a master's degree in modern history from St Andrews, Scotland, a degree from the College of Law in London, and a master's degree in international security affairs from the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. The way this panel is going to work is we're going to have roughly half of it spent on 2 questions from me, and then the second half is going to be spent on answering questions from the audience. You're going to have roughly 3 to 4 minutes for each of the 2 questions, although feel free to go a little under or a little bit over. My co-moderator, who's going to be helping me with audience questions, is Leo Kerner. He is a junior at Harvard College. He was the president of the Harvard Republican Club. And we're going to open with a question that is certainly too broad for the short time that we have, but just as a framing to various questions about immigration and about deportations and other maybe policy issues in this area. I'd like to start with the very broad question: what does it mean to be an American, and what makes Americans distinct from other nations? We can maybe go left to right down the stage. If you'd like to start, Professor Wax.
Okay, well, 4 minutes on what is American identity. No problem. I think American identity, in my mind, has 3 components. First and foremost, it is defined by citizenship. Our identity is national identity. We're all part of a nation that we share and have in common, the United States of America, and it has its history, ideals, institution, values, particular origins, and also duties and responsibilities that require that we support and sacrifice for one another and put citizens first. And if that sounds like America first, I'm all for it. Second, America is a heritage home with a particular and peculiar historical legacy: European, Western, Judeo-Christian, highly Anglo-inflected. We are a weird people, to use Professor Heinrich's acronym: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, with universalist commitments, to be sure, to the rule of law, human rights, property rights, integrity of the individual, but also parochial traditions and commitments. Our Whiggishness, mistrust of central authority, aversion to overweening power, tolerance for disagreement, however grudging, and for a loyal opposition, our high mutual trust and solidarity, a bourgeois commitment to truth, honesty, fair dealing, personal and civic virtue, responsibility, self-reliance, self-development and improvement, and above all, our commitment to and love of liberty in politics, economics, speech, thought, and conscience. Now, not all of these are in the proper balance at all times. Some have been denigrated, some have become overweening, and none of this is purely self-created. It comes to us from our ancestors. Finally, the last component of American identity, and here I tip my hat away from Vivek, consists of a distinctive spirit and culture and character, which accounts, I think, for American greatness. To capture it requires a long list. Our verb, energy, enthusiasm, can-do spirit, exuberance, optimism, ambition, love of prosperity, love of improvement, of self-improvement, our perseverance, our willingness to work hard and endure hardship, our Horatio Alger belief in the meritocracy, and that effort and talent should and will be rewarded, all tempered with a love of what exists, of our own, of stability, continuity, community, and tradition, nurtured by piety and reverence for our country, for its ideals, and our admiration and appreciation of its outsized achievements. In sum, our patriotism. For all this, for all these elements, there's no precise prescription, no cut and dried formula, no neat propositional scheme. Rather, American identity is a fortuitous and fortunate combination, a delicate balance and rebalance of sometimes contradictory elements present in varying degrees, that is ever evolving, hopefully slowly, and nurtured by our founding and history. It's a robust ecology, but also a vulnerable and fragile one. Once it is destroyed, we can't get it back. And right now, it's under a wrecking ball from many quarters, but we mess with it at our peril. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm a Yale alum, so I appreciate that, particularly not being handed off the campus. And also, it's a pleasure to be on a panel, particularly with Professor Wax, who, although she was on her best behavior, I rarely get to be the moderate on a panel. So I appreciate that opportunity here. I do want to pick up on a couple of things that she said about, hey, I think the balance of these things is important. I mean, we're not just a genetic ethnos in the way that Europe is, but I think, and now here's the other fallacy, because I think people in the US kind of understand that, we're also not just an idea. Okay, and I think this is really important, and that's something that, you know, maybe folks here who are conservatives and you're at Harvard, et cetera, like, so maybe that is not a shocking statement to you, but I think it would be a shocking statement to a lot of people, because guess what? If we're an idea, I want to kick a bunch of people out of this country who don't believe in that idea, you know, right? Like, do we kick people out who don't believe? It's like, I'll tell you, like, what America's historic identity is, okay, and it's not embraced by, ideologically by a huge percentage, if not the vast majority of American states. So if America is just an idea, then are we going to kick out people who don't subscribe to that idea? No, we're not. So we're a historic people, okay? And we're a historic people. We have our origin in Europe, particularly in Northwestern Europe, particularly, if we're going to be even more specific, for most of our early history in England and the British Isles. I kind of walked through this. I wrote a book in the last few months called The Unprotected Class, on the rise of anti-white racism in the United States, kind of a spicy book, as you might imagine from that topic. But I get into a lot of the myths around immigration in that book that we have. And one of the foremost myth that we probably have that was fomented upon us by a Harvard grad, I do need to say John F. Kennedy, is this notion that we're a nation of immigrants. And I'm not going to deprive myself of book royalties by giving you the whole argument here today. You can go buy the book and read the chapter. But basically, to kind of make a long story short, this was, down to the phrase, something that came out of the 1960 presidential campaign for the Democrats. They were looking to basically get white ethnics, particularly Catholics, in the Midwest. And so they kind of created this nation of immigrants ideology. And of course, this is not to say, of course, we've had immigration throughout our history. But I wrote a piece a few years back called A Nation of Settlers in the American Mind. It actually had quite a bit of influence. And literally, Dinesh D'Souza was talking to me about it on his show a couple days ago, which is not bad for a 3-year-old internet piece. But essentially, from our early history, we had a pattern of settlement. And then where we were pioneers, we weren't going to join an existing society. From there, we moved to a mix of settlement and immigration going on. And this is, we're talking about hundreds of years of American history. It's really only when the frontier closes, according to the US Census Bureau in 1890, that anything like the notion of a nation of immigrants could be said to apply even remotely to this country. So I think, I don't want to take up too much time early, I'll simply just say, we are not a nation of immigrants, we are a nation with immigrants. And that to me is the core distinction that we need to understand when we're looking about this problem. And that it's not, finally, that we're not just America as an idea, although we certainly do have ideas, but we're America as a distinct people with a heritage, and that our immigration policy and everything else needs to follow in uniting a new American ethnos, but one that keeps that heritage in mind when we do it. So thank you.
Well, I think it's important to start off by saying that the most important fact about American identity is that it could stand some improvement. So America has a heritage, an excellent heritage, of this combination of adventure and outstanding outcomes. That combination of the two is, I think, the best part of American identity. Excellence combined with adventure. And the actual heritage Americans who are in this country at this point are a combination of great Americans who are part of that adventure, who are part of that excellence, some bad Americans who are actually hurting that project, and a lot of folks in the middle. And fortunately, we have a way to build upon the excellence and make America a better country that can better achieve this excellence. And a well-chosen immigration policy, in my view, is central to making America a place that achieves the best parts of its identity. I often think of Charles de Gaulle's statement that he had a certain idea of France. And he said, to him, France could not be France without grandeur. And in my mind, and I think in the minds of many of us, America cannot be America without excellence and adventure combined. And so finding ways to build upon that and finding ways to welcome new Americans who will actually improve upon that heritage will be important. So immigration policy, fortunately, can be used to dilute the influence of Americans who are likely to be in that mediocre to negative contribution category. Right? Bringing in new Americans is a way to make America better by changing the composition of the nation through bringing in folks who have the traits that would make our nation better. And I think, in particular, most immigration policy debates focus on the first generation. Can we bring in people who themselves will be good? I think real American identity is about focusing on the very long run. When we think about the founding fathers who fought a revolution not for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren. Similarly, our immigration policy, our plans for future American identity should be about shaping not just this generation, but future generations. Fortunately, modern social science research gives us a lot of tools to do that. Rather than just sort of opening the door and seeing who shows up, which is what a lot of America did in the 19th century, we can actually use modern social science to find a mixture of what normally people think of as skilled immigration policy, H-1B improved in a lot of ways, but on top of that, giving at least some small to moderate weight in our immigration policy to the average traits of the nations that people come from. If I had to pick three traits that I would put in my sort of ideal little points-based migration system, traits that look at where a person's ancestors came from, I would pick the savings rate in the country the person came from, the rate of corruption by conventional measures, and average test scores, maybe the World Bank's new standardized test scores. Some kind of average weighting of, are people coming from nations that are frugal? Are they coming from nations that are not that corrupt? And they're coming from nations with high test scores. These are all traits that on average are passed on for 2 or 3 generations, maybe much longer. So we can bring in folks who will change America for not just for decades to come, for centuries to come. We can choose to make America a better nation through a well-chosen immigration policy. Fortunately, so here at the Charles Hotel, in the elevators, they tell us their slogan. The slogan of the hotel is, "Come for the IQ, stay for the adventure." That, I think, should be the heart of both our view of what American excellence is, American identity is, and the best of America's future.
Well, I always tell my kids that if you work really hard and you strive, all your life at some point you'll be the dumbest guy in the room. So here I am. I'm not going to repeat some of the things I agree with, but I'm going to step back 30,000 feet and just make one observation. I think one of the big struggles of our time is globalism versus nation states. And I'm a nationalist. I'm not a globalist. I love my family more than other people's families. I love my country more than other countries. Now, I think if you talk to any Frenchman or Japanese or Indian, they would love their country more than the next door country, and they think that their country is better than the others. Doesn't mean they're going to invade them, but that's a natural human thing. And there are a significant percentage of Americans who believe the exact opposite. In this country, we have the communists or the socialists, it's basically the same thing, and the libertarians who I would say believe in human beings as labor units. If Carlos can make the same number of cars as Charles, then who cares? If Waleed can make the same number of widgets as Walter, then what does it matter if one of them knows the national anthem, the history of the country, sends his sons to fight to defend that country, and wants the country to succeed more than the one that he came from. This country has turned immigrants into Americans, and that's an incredibly important process that we seem to be forgetting about with the whole salad bowl notion. It's not an accident that the Internationale is the communist theme song. Conservatives don't have an international theme song because we believe each country, like each family, decides its own path and makes its own future. I think that French people are different from Japanese people, are different from British people based on their values, based on their history, based on their willingness to defend their traditions. The left globally believes in, now they call it abolitionism. They don't mean of slavery, which happened 150 years ago. They mean abolition of borders, of law enforcement, of nation states. They believe that there's an international right to migration, wherever you want to go, and they've made this happen in the last 4 years in the US with euphemisms like safe, orderly, lawful pathways, etc., feeding people into the asylum system who are not refugees by any plausible definition. So I think that's the big picture is what makes an American different from a Frenchman or from a Yemeni. I would say Dr. Wax hit a few of my top notes. I won't repeat, but freedom of speech, freedom to live as you want to live, as long as you don't bother others. Equal opportunity, not equal outcomes. Ditching all the class and historical baggage. No one cares if your grandfather was an aristocrat in the United States. You know, most of us came from nothing, and we don't care where you went to college. After 5 years, if you still have to tell people you went to Harvard, you're not doing well in life. And Harvard's a great school, don't get me wrong. And we believe in individual agency, not collective action. So those are the high points for me of what it means to be an American. And by the way, I know a little bit about assimilation. I came here when I was 6, and I had to figure it all out, from day one, Pledge of Allegiance, and I'm still here and proud to be here.
Now, we've briefly touched, or a couple of our panelists have touched on immigration, but I'd like to get a little bit more concrete about immigration policy. Specifically how maybe the last administration's immigration policy or the historic immigration policy of at least the left's preferred immigration policy, maybe the policy under the Biden administration, versus our current immigration policy, versus maybe what immigration policy would look like in a perfect world if it were up to you, might help or harm Americans.
Yeah, well, I've gone on the record and I've written essays. My position is that our immigration policy right now, at this point, historical point, not necessarily appropriate to the past, should be low and slow. We should let in relatively few people. We should let them in slowly, not a sort of torrent of mass immigration, because we need to go back to the old-fashioned assimilation project. The second tenet is that we should favor people, and here I agree with Garett, but I would have somewhat different criteria, with whom we have an affinity. Right? So people who understand, appreciate, and have some experience with, and here I'm channeling Michael Anton at Claremont, appreciate, understand, and have experience with our way of life, our commitments, our liberties, our sense of adventure, and our self-fashioning, not to too great an extent, of course, and all of that. And that does mean that we are going to disfavor some parts of the world, and that's just a fact. The second thing I want to say is, we've had a debate about H-1B visas and whether we should bring in people who are high-skilled, low-skilled, in between. I think we definitely should get rid of chain migration. We should get rid of the diversity lottery. Our entire immigration legal system, which is barnacled and obscure and impossible to understand, should be scrapped, and we should start all over. And have some high-skilled immigration, the very highest skill, but not too much, because we're a nation of 350 million people. And we have the skills here. We're not really developing them. That's a problem with our education system, which of course feeds into our immigration policy. And this attitude that the left has promoted, that there are jobs that Americans won't do and shouldn't have to do. Everybody deserves a good job. Well, here's the problem. Many Americans do not have the competence and the skills for the jobs that need to be done in the economy, and that has to be addressed. And what are the obstacles to that? They're everywhere, right? Take the New York Times recently had an article. You can't talk about competence when you're discussing DEI. That's forbidden. That's racism. That's the New York Times telling us to stick with the PC program and stay within the Overton window. Well, I'm sorry, but that just won't fly. The elites need to talk about the work ethic, the competence, the education system, how it's preparing Americans to do jobs, and if people are not prepared, they need to go and fill the jobs that we are now filling with these waves of immigrants. So all of this stuff needs to be reassessed.
Yeah, I'd largely agree with everything Amy said, except maybe this time I'd be even more radical. I mean, I'm much more focused right now on repatriation than I am on any immigration at all. I think, and I usually choose my words pretty carefully, and so I'm going to actually this time too. We have just witnessed 4 years of treason from the Biden administration, who willfully allowed our border to be invaded. They could have stopped it, but in a cynical attempt to destroy the historic American people, to get in more voters who are going to vote Democrat, which by the way turned out sort of one of the delicious ironies maybe not to be so true, because we saw a lot of these groups move a little bit more toward the Republican side, but they brought in waves of people with no care at all as to whether they were here legally or illegally. They attempted to destroy any real distinction, and the media would sometimes, carry water for them, pretending not to. But you're seeing right now, we've basically reduced illegal immigration to almost zero right now at the border, just without even any legislation at all, just from having a president who actually is trying to enforce the law, as opposed to a president who's trying to break the law. And I mean, I certainly hope that we have the DOJ go after some of the most senior people in the Biden administration for what I view as criminal activity that they were abetting. So let me kind of start out by putting that down. Then, as far as who we bring, again, low and slow, I think we're almost at a point where it really needs to be zero or net negative for a while, because we need to reconstitute an American identity. Okay, like what does it even mean? What are we? Who are we? To Sam Huntington, former Harvard professor, asked in a famous book. Now, I'm now revealing my age. Probably almost 3 decades ago that I read that when it came out. But we're not obviously just a nation of European descended people anymore, but we've got to build a new American ethnos. And it's really hard for me to imagine how we do that if we don't dramatically reduce the number of people coming in. And we can do this. So you go back to World War II, and you can go watch these World War II movies, and even the process of all these different groups getting thrown together. You combine this with the low immigration that started with the 1924 bill, and you sort of saw a uniquely kind of unified sense, and I'm not trying to erase all of the problems and difficulties that did exist, but of American identity coming out of that period into the 1950s. We built ourselves up into one nation through effectively bringing migration to an incredibly low level. We need to reconstitute that process with the new Americans that we have here, figure out what that looks like. But I think the first law of holes is when you're in one, stop digging, okay? We need to stop digging, and we need to take a break. We need to reconstitute a new American nation out of the folks who are here as legal citizens today. And I think the next steps for what immigration ultimately looks like beyond that will become apparent at that point. I don't want to forecast 80 years down the line for what America is going to look like. We have had changing identities, but right now, due to the treasonous, perfidious, you pick your negative attitudes of the previous Democrat administration, and by the way, the previous ones before that were not that much better. They just, at least they paid lip service to pretending that we're all, that we should care who's here legally and illegally. We've got to just stop, take a breather, and figure out where to go next from here, and what a future American identity will look like once we've got control of the border.
Well, I think that hoping that immigrants assimilate to American mediocrity is a mistake. If we look around at the actual culture around us, we're looking at a culture of TikTok, of people who are barely literate, people who know almost nothing about their culture. I don't want people assimilating to that. I follow the old Washington, D.C. advice that personnel is policy, and if I want better policy in a country, I should start bringing in some better personnel. Hoping that we can have some good government lessons, some speeches from the president, I don't know, maybe some education in K through 6 that's new PowerPoints that talk about how great America is. Hoping that that's going to change things is a false hope. Bringing in people who are going to make your country better on average, and at enough scale that they will actually have an impact on who the American average person is, what we call in political science the median voter, that is going to change things. We can hope that other kinds of change might fortuitously happen through just random cultural change. But if you really want to change American culture for the better, finding ways to bring in folks for the long run whose children and grandchildren are likely, on average, to boost American excellence is the way to do that. So creating, part of the reason I value American excellence is because I think America has this a world historical importance, and it can do things and has done things that almost no nation in history has. And we have to do that by having a lot of incredibly intelligent, skilled, competent people, and increasing that number by the tens of millions is a way to actually change what average American culture is like.
Well, my general observation would be that immigration policy for every nation needs to be whatever is in the best interests of that country, and not whatever is in the best interests of whoever happens to show up at the border on a particular day. And George Borhaus did some research that I can summarize as basically mass migration is a wealth transfer from native losers, meaning people with a high school education born here, to native winners, meaning people who own companies and own stock, and immigrants. There's also a speed of assimilation. I don't know if it's a formula, how many people it would be per year for the United States. Right now we take in 1 million people. But in Europe, we've seen some pretty clear examples of exceeding that speed of assimilation. If you look at the crime rate, here all the time people will say, there's no such thing, and a migrant crime is much lower than native crime. That's bogus. There's no data on it other than Texas, and I think Tennessee's got 3 months of data now that they've collected. But let's take a look at Europe, just a couple stats. There were 677 gang rapes in Germany in 2021. Migrants were 50% of the suspects, and that was twice the number in 2018. Algerians are 10 times as likely to be criminal suspects in Spain and Germany, and 17 times more likely in Italy. In Sweden, 63% of rapists are migrants or children of migrants, and migrants are 73% of murder and attempted murder suspects. Now, what they found also in that study, interestingly, was that that statistic goes down the longer those people have been in Sweden. So, in a generation, in 2 generations, it's quite possible that the assimilation power of a generally peaceful society like Sweden will lower those rates of violent crime and sexual assault. But you see this all through Europe. In the Netherlands and in Germany, it's roughly the same statistic. 50% of violent crime is committed by about 14% of the population that are migrants from a small number of countries. So why would we expect it to be any different in the United States? In Sweden, the Algerian rape rate is 122 times the native-born Swedish rate. Not percent, 122 times. The Afghan is 69 times. Now, this is not to vilify those societies. This is simply to say that as a modern Western society with certain values, if you expect certain things of people that you bring in, then you need to bring in numbers that you can teach those lessons to within a generation, or else you're going to put up with significantly higher crime and lower economic productivity. So I think what we have seen in the last 4 years, and I've written 180 pieces on this, I'm afraid, a lot of repetition there, and done a lot of media appearances saying exactly the same thing. The Biden administration deliberately opened our borders because they believe in this international right to migrate, and they used all kinds of gimmicks like parole, catch and release at the border, cynically, to bring people in for ideological reasons. And I think we are now experiencing the results, which is that it was too fast for our assimilative ability. The United States is probably one of the best assimilators in the world, but we are not invincible. We cannot have an unlimited number of people, and our policy got so far out of whack that it needs to get back within parameters, and then we can take a look at what do we need going forward. Skills-based, I'm entirely with that, as opposed to family-based migration, and maybe some hard evidence that people have those skills and can contribute to our economy in numbers that we can absorb.
Thank you. We're going to be moving to audience questions now. I invite anyone in the audience who has a question to scan one of the QR codes on either side of the stage and submit it. And you'll also see, I think, questions that other people have asked. You'll be able to, thumbs up the questions that you'd like to see answered the most. Leo, take it away.
Great. The first question here on the top, how important is maintaining America's white majority to our cultural cohesion and further success?
Can I address that? Before I talk about that, I just want to follow up on one thing that Jeremy said. The Democrats are always talking about rule of law, legality, corrosion of rule of law. There is nothing more blatantly unlawful than their immigration policy. I would like to revive the phrase, "What about illegal don't you understand?" All right, let's get that back. Let's get that back in the vocabulary. We really need that. There shouldn't be a single illegal person here, okay? Whiteness, you always get into trouble by talking about whiteness. I prefer to think about our nation as a European nation, primarily. I have said, and I have talked to students about this, I think our nation needs a demographically dominant group that represents its culture. That group should be numerically and otherwise dominant, not exclusive, but dominant. And that is a weird culture, European. That is our origin. Those are our institutions, our ideas. That's where we come from. And that is the secret sauce of our success, that we have achieved prosperity, stability, the best society the world has ever known for most people. And I don't think it's a good idea to change that drastically. If you look at the debates surrounding the 1964 Immigration Act, and of course we had almost a complete hiatus of immigration from 24 to 64, and that was our heyday. Those were our glory years. So the notion that we need to constantly bring in people in order to succeed, I think, is just false. But if you look at those debates, everybody across the political spectrum promised the American people, we will not drastically change the demographic profile of this nation. And that is just sneered at as xenophobia, prejudice, racism, etc. No, I don't think that's fair. I think it stems from an understanding that people make the culture, people make the country, right? And we need demographic stability because we want a certain degree of preservation. So I think it's important to have a European majority, frankly.
There's a book by a scholar named Eric Coughlin, who's at the University of Buckingham in the UK, called White Shift, that I would recommend for folks who want to think seriously about this type of issue. And he himself is actually an example of this. We would actually, it's funny because this is kind of a left-wing term, but I'm going to appropriate it for the right because I think that's good. Multiracial whiteness. And that Coughlin himself has got a variety of different, I think he's partially Puerto Rican, he's partially Asian, kind of looks phenotypically white, I think he's partially Jewish, he's partially British, maybe anyway. This is a way of saying, again, I hate to do this too much because the left uses this in all sorts of very dishonest ways in scholarship of saying like the whiteness is just like socially defined. No, I mean actually if you go back to the original Naturalization Act and the debates around that in 1790, there were actually kind of pretty well understood definitions that have not changed dramatically. But having said that, I think that, and this is what I was kind of getting at when I talk about a new American ethnos and some of my my previous comments, that if you stop giving incentives for people to identify as things other than white, which is what our system has been doing, and Trump, to his great credit, is attempting to take an axe to a lot of that right now. People actually do want to identify with both the majority and the historic majority of a country, and they want to identify with that culture. And you're going to have, I mean, by the way, I think like 5 or 6% of America is now multiracial, and that's going to continue to rise as people intermarry, as they do. And how people choose to identify with that is a function of like, what are we incentivizing as a society? And I think we should be incentivizing, again, I mean, I think it's a tricky thing. I don't think you can easily pin it down, but kind of having us identify with the European history of America and its founders and its generation, even if, fine, like your particular, if you do a 23andMe test on you, you're going to be X% of this and X% of something else. That's what's really important, is having that majority population that sees itself as a nation, as a people having a continuous history, even if that history may have a bunch of different strands from elsewhere, but we have a sort of primary source of identification. Diversity is a weakness, not a strength, okay? Unity is a strength. And this is something that, again, used to be just sort of obvious to people and is now kind of a shocking act of racism or something else when you say it. Now, obviously, you can go too far, right? I mean, if you have pure unity, you have fascism. If you have pure diversity, you have anarchy. So I'm not saying that like we all have to be exactly the same, and if we're not the same, and if there's not some paper bag test for your whiteness, you're somehow out of the club, right? Like, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that it's a good thing to, I kind of turn around the question and say it's a good thing to have a unified ethnic majority. And I'm not interested in like having to genetically test every member of that ethnic majority to say, well, you're actually from here, so you don't get to count. But it's a way of how we conceive ourselves as a people. That's what's really important. What is our heritage? What is our history? Who do we belong to? And that's what we need to keep in an undisputed majority going forward. And the Democrats are frankly have been, their project for the last 50 years plus has been to put that at risk.
Yeah. In my book, The Culture Transplant, I cover the academic literature on the cost of ethnic diversity. One phrase that's used frequently in the business literature that studies this is the double-edged sword of diversity. Diversity is a double-edged sword. Shows up a lot. Try it on Google Scholar sometime. Anyway, so the idea, I'd say if I could glibly sum up what happens in this literature is that ethnic diversity is sort of a net cost. Skill diversity, people being good at different stuff, what I call Firefly diversity, from the TV show Firefly, where everyone on the ship had their own little skill. That seems to be an obvious net strength. But behind that, when we look at the estimates of how big the costs are of ethnic diversity, in terms of social conflict at the national level, or in terms of firm productivity at the very micro level, where you can probably understand it better. In both those cases, I'd say those are entirely swamped by the effects of just having smarter folks around. So again, an immigration policy that I think focuses on excellence will tend to swamp and make practically irrelevant the costs of ethnic diversity. America's already had its heritage stock wiped out a couple of times. I mean, some of us here have German ancestors, Germans, Scandinavians, Italians. Somehow, as I'm sure many of you would point out, like somehow they all sort of worked it out. And those turned out not to be important sources of ethnic conflict, thank the gods. But we live in a nation that culturally is totally unrecognizable to that of the founders of our country, and I still think it worked out pretty well. Part of the reason is because America was fortunate to have, fortuitously or by planning, a net effect of having immigrants who were on average pretty sharp.
I think this question is definitely different for European countries or Japan than it is for the United States, because we don't have, like the Hungarians or the Serbs or the Russians, an ethnic identity that you can observe. One question I often ask is, what is peak diversity? You'll often hear, we're going to hire a diverse candidate, which essentially means not a white man. And sometimes you'll see a group of people in a board or on a TV ad, and there'll be 8 women out of 9, and they'll consider that a diverse group. So the word is being applied in ways that are perhaps not mathematically accurate. So what is peak diversity is maybe a question we should ask if that's a goal that politicians are trying to achieve. And I would say for the US, I don't think it really matters what the percentages are, as long as we're not playing the DEI game. And what we saw, it's gotten really bad in the last 5 years. In my career, when I started in 1999, it wasn't really a big issue. But if we're all going to have a zero-sum game where there are quotas and you're judged based on your sex, based on your race, your identity group, bingo card of how many tickets you have to play, then I think we're really screwed. If that's the path we're going to take, then the more diverse we get, the worse things are going to get. We're going to balkanize ourselves. If we can return to a focus on merit, on ability, on people doing what they want to do, and then being judged according to how they do that job. And we hire air traffic controllers, for example, who take a test that tests how well you can control air traffic, and doctors and lawyers and so on. I think we'd be in good shape, and I don't really care what this country looks like in 100 years physically, what color it is. So for me, that's the fight that we need to have now. We need to get rid of the identitarian system that has sort of smuggled itself into place in academia and in our companies and in our government, and get back to a system that pays attention to what individuals can do.
The next question here, what should we do with immigrants who are already here under various temporary or permanent legal designations, but who don't meet your criteria for a good immigrant?
I'll say we have time for maybe one more question, maybe 2 if everyone is relatively quick. So that's up to us how much in depth we want to go on these last questions.
Well, this is a complex legal landscape, and that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that we don't have a legible immigration policy that ordinary people can understand, so the elites are kind of, imposing on us all of these subterfuges for bringing people in because they engage in this cult of diversity, and it really is this cult of diversity that has taken over. I would phase out as many of these programs as I could. Let's talk about 2. Students. I don't think that, nurses and truck drivers should be paying taxes so that go to universities as funding so that they can educate people from Africa, Saudi Arabia, wherever. I don't think that that's fair. I think we should go back to an America First policy in our universities. Now, maybe a little bit in graduate school, we want very, very outstanding scholars, It should be a tiny trickle. So we should go back actually to what prevailed when I was in college. I was in college in the early 70s. I didn't know one single foreign-born student. And, you know, I always tell my students, Yale in 1971 was head over heels better than it is today, right? In pretty much in every way. So I don't think we're going to sacrifice anything for that. H-1B visas been the subject of controversy. If I was the czar, I would totally get rid of them. Right? Once again, we have 350 million people in this country. Maybe they all want to be filmmakers and, you know, join NGOs, but they have to fill the jobs that exist. We should be able to create a workforce that can do this work. And, you know, the notion that H-1B has anything to do with free markets, that's a canard. It's a form of indentured servitude. So, you know, there's a lot of these programs, a lot of these temporary visas that we could get rid of. The whole green card business, once again, I would scrap our current Hart-Celler Act. I would start all over. We probably need many fewer. So, you know, we could go through the list and we could probably get rid of a lot of these.
Yeah, I think one other category, I mean, I would largely just agree with what Amy said. One other category I'd add is temporary protected status. And I can't even, you know, Trump is doing so many things at a time, I can't even keep track of them, where everything sits right now. I know he's been moving on this, but the temporary protected status that we've given, you know, refugees from certain nations, and again, it's usually completely bogus. I would do away with every single one of those, and frankly, I would abolish the entire idea because it's just a really bad idea. You know, H-1Bs, yes, I mean, again, people like me have been writing about what a scam this is for decades. We actually do have a visa already, an O1 visa that really deals with people who are extraordinarily talented, who are going to be here. You know, having said all that and been that hardcore, I do think it's important to, you know, have distinctions. I mean, certainly, if you're a legal immigrant and you're a legal citizen of the United States, then you're in Club America as far as I'm concerned, okay? I mean, so, like, whether or not I might have made a different policy decision when you were naturalized, that's irrelevant, right? Like, that's just, I don't know any other way as long as the processes that were followed were legal and appropriate to do things. So I do think that there has to be some balance. I'm not trying to kick people out of the club who, in my mind, are in the club. You know, that's what reconstituting a new identity as a country has got to be. It's got to include people who are current citizens. But pretty much all of these things, I mean, again, the more you know about them, these are all just scams. I mean, I just hate to break it to every single one of them. Okay, and there's a small layer. Now, as a policy choice, we could make a choice like my friend here is saying, no, actually, we really just want to recruit you know, tens of millions of really bright people. I'm sort of I hope I'm not oversimplifying you, and there'll be some advantage. That's a totally reasonable view. It's not necessarily my view, I think, but it's at least a defensible view, and it's very different than anything that we've been doing. I would point north to Canada for those of you who've actually been following what they do, which I think has not been, they've kind of had a skills-based immigration. I certainly don't think it's been in our interest. I don't think it's been in their interest either. You basically have massive amounts of Chinese, particularly, and Indian to a lesser degree, very nefarious influence on the government. And when I say that, I'm not talking about my ethnicity, I'm talking about actual state of China, state of India, affecting the policies of Canada in very negative ways because they just said, well, let's open the door and have 10 kajillion folks, you know, based on test scores. So I am a little nervous about that, but at least I think it's a debatable policy that would be reasonable. But none of the stuff we've been doing on immigration in America for decades now has been at all reasonable or at all defensible. And the more you know about it, just the more kind of corrupt and pathetic and dishonest it is.
I agree with Jeremy that it's good to stick to the constitutional rule, sort of unwritten constitutional rule that once somebody is here under through legal paths, that person's in the club and has a very strong right here. I think that's something that's helps people plan for the future. And part of that is that it creates a self-commitment problem, a self-commitment promise, in a sense, for the American government. You should create a set of rules now so that once you bring somebody in, you know you're stuck with them for a long time. If our governments were foresighted enough to think in those terms, then they would be making decisions about, in terms of thinking, if we admit this person, if this person gets green card status, they and their descendants are going to be Americans, and we should have some people calculate some decent back of the envelope estimates of what the long run estimates of that are, what the long run benefits and costs of that are. At bare minimum, we should have a immigration policy that makes a strong effort to maximize the long run net government surplus created by each immigrant. America turns out to have a pretty stingy welfare state compared to a lot of Europeans, so we can pull off having some lower skilled immigrants who aren't a net drain on the fisc, but we should be thinking from the top down. Who will be bringing in $5, 10, $20 million net present value into the American fisc if we admit them and their children into being American taxpayers for the future? Finding folks who will pay down our debt should be an important policy.
Did you want to see a summary of what I'm about to say? I wrote an article called "The 5 Favorite Fudges the Biden Administration Used." Temporary protected status. We've had people from El Salvador, 20,000 people who were protected from an earthquake that happened in the late 1990s. That program, it makes sense, but it's been completely blown out of the water. Optional practical training was a completely bogus and illegal scheme that they came up with to try to keep people who were here on temporary work visas, like the H-1B. It says temporary right in the name, so that they could bridge the time that it took for them to become immigrants. Now, I'm all in favor of a trickle, a flow of highly skilled immigrants. When people tell you that everybody applying at the border is a highly skilled immigrant, that is simply not the case. I've been there, I've met many of them. A lot of people coming in under some of these under student programs, they're not doing STEM degrees at Harvard and Yale. They're doing community college degrees in studies that are not things that we can't find Americans to do. There's something called deferred and forced departure. I love this one. So let's say you go through the entire system and an immigration judge after 5-10 years says, "I'm sorry, sir, you don't qualify for asylum." And then they decide we're going to defer your departure. What would be the point of that if it was, say, traffic law? You stop someone for drunk driving, you convict them sentence them to 6 months in jail, and you say, we're going to defer the sentence indefinitely, so just go home. What a colossal waste of money. Prosecutorial discretion, some of you lawyers in the room know what that is, has been abused. Hundreds of thousands of cases, they've just decided they're not going to bother to prosecute those, even though what the people did is against the law. And then parole, the mother of all scams under the Biden administration, intended maybe a couple hundred people a year, used for 1.5 million, entirely ultra-virus. I and many other smarter lawyers would argue. And on Canada, I just wrote one called Canada's Migrant Time Bomb, which describes their situation, which was not about bringing in high-skilled immigrants. It started off that way. In theory, their system looked better than ours, but what they did in the last 10 years is they brought people who were very marginal students going to fly-by-night colleges, and now those people don't want to go home after their supposedly temporary time in Canada, and that's about 5 million that they've got coming up for expiry in this coming year. That's going to be fun to watch.
I think that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank all of our wonderful panelists. I hope you can